Gray is going out of style, and that's exactly why you need to use it. Stick around and I'll tell you how I've been using gray this year. On the Paint People channel, we talk a lot about colors, as we try and break them down as objectively as we can in terms of their perceived undertones and their light reflectance value, and some popular ways to use said colors. And when we started this channel, our goal was to keep doing that with as many colors as possible, because there are really so many out there, and so many of you have so many different opinions on all of them. This is amazing because it further shows how subjective and personal design is. Forget design, color is mega subjective, because you and I can look at the exact same color in the same room under the same lighting conditions and see two different things. Our perception can be different, but also our biology can be different and impact how warm or cool or how green or pink a color ends up looking. But even with all these differences and all these different opinions, there seems to be one through line that remains pretty consistent with a lot of us, and that's we're tired of seeing gray being used. It doesn't matter what form of gray we're talking about, whether it's a mid-tone cement gray or a warmer leaning grayish, or even an off-white with a touch of gray that feels pretty light and airy, but also a bit pedestrian. The thing about gray is it can make an appearance in many colors of varying levels of saturation. In fact, there's an entire aspect of color theory called tones, which essentially is a color hue with different levels of gray added into it to desaturate or muddy the color a little bit. That's usually what I refer to when I call a color dusty. Essentially, it means it isn't a pure representation of the color hue. It almost looks like it has a thin coat of dust over the top of it, which makes it a little more subtle in its hue. Why did gray become so popular in the first place? If we're talking more recently, gray grew in popularity with the emergence of neutral color palettes. People were no longer throwing up bright, bold accent colors on their walls because they wanted to opt for a more simplistic, minimalist approach to design that they wouldn't need to change up and repaint every few years as the trends began to change. It's almost like neutrals were a bit of an anti-trend, because the thought process behind them was keep your place a neutral canvas so then you can freely change up your accessories without having to change everything else. This anti-trend became the clear dominant trend, and gray was very much part of that, especially as technology began to advance. We started seeing more stainless steels everywhere, and everyone started getting those aluminum unibody MacBooks, which were popping up everywhere. Even floors started turning gray. It's as if people slapped a black and white filter on top of their previous color palettes and then called it a day. That's one of the main reasons that people became sick of gray, because that's all they started seeing. Everything seemed like one form of gray or another. So I do understand a lot of the exhaustion many of us feel towards poor gray. And yes, I kind of feel bad for gray, because it's not gray's fault that it was overused. It's not Carly Rae Jepsen's fault for Call Me Maybe being played to death. Okay, that's a bad example, but shout out to my fellow Canadians. Gray just seems to work with so many different color palettes because it's not very polarizing. Or at least it shouldn't be. It didn't matter whether you incorporated blues, reds, or yellows alongside it, you'll definitely find some form of gray that would work perfectly no matter what. Of all the major color categories, maybe next to off-white, gray just seems to be so usable. And that's one of the main reasons that I'm not quite ready to give it up yet. Now, before you click away, just give me one chance to defend my old friend, gray. First things first is you shouldn't be too caught up with trends in general, or especially what other people think is the right color for your space. It's 100% yours, your domain. You have every right to put any color you want, no matter how gray it looks. The second thing is every project that I work on is different, and if gray is going to work best, then guess what I'm going to recommend? Gray can also be such a perfect transitional color between two fairly different spaces. For example, a cool office to a warm kitchen connected by a hallway. It's so utilitarian as a color group, and you can really use it strategically to enhance the flow of a space really nicely. While you can really easily overdo gray, this year I have rediscovered how to implement gray in my color palettes. I've drifted away from making it my default color option that I start with a lot of my projects, as I have personally gone back to warmer, cozier colors in general, but by doing that, it creates a wonderful, slightly complementary backdrop for the more cooler grays to emerge as accents in a way. I really feel that the key to an effective color palette for a lot of people is creating a clear sense of balance. And by having that charcoal gray couch surrounded by creams and warm browns, it gives that nice little juxtaposition that creates an interesting space. Add a bit of texture and some pops of more saturated colors, and there you go. I encourage you to rethink gray today and see if there are fresh new ways you can utilize it in your space. But if you're still fond of dominating your color scheme with it, that's perfectly fine as well. Whatever you decide to do, just do it with the colorful confidence that I aim to instill in all of you. Ignore the haters.